The email arrived unexpectedly one late afternoon, brief and to the point. It was from the producers of the Morning Exchange, one of the most watched and influential talk shows in America. They wanted Darius Bell, the tech entrepreneur and CEO of Innovis, to appear on their upcoming segment about diversity in business. At first glance, it seemed like a typical invitation, a platform eager to parade a successful black entrepreneur for a few minutes of applause before moving on to the next trending topic. But this time, something felt different. Darius Bell wasn't your average entrepreneur. Innovis wasn't some upstart company scratching for attention. It had just secured a multi-million-dollar defense contract, outbidding some of the biggest names in the tech industry. This wasn't luck. It was 2 decades of relentless work and perseverance. But despite his success, Darius hesitated. Something felt off. His assistant, Tasha, immediately noticed the shift in his mood. "You sure about this?" she asked, knowing the game all too well. "You know how they are. They love a success story, but they love tearing one down even more." Darius leaned back in his chair, contemplating. "I'll handle it. National exposure is still exposure. Let's see what they have to say." Despite his confidence, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to walk into a setup. But one thing was certain. If they were playing chess, they were about to realize they were up against a grandmaster. The day of the interview, Darius arrived at the KXNT studios in Los Angeles. The air in the green room was cool and sterile, the energy flat, devoid of the excitement one might expect before a live show. A young producer greeted him with barely a glance up from her clipboard. "Mr. Bell, thanks for being here. We'll mic you up in 5, she said. No small talk, no pleasantries, just another transaction. As he sat in the makeup chair, an assistant powdered his face with practiced indifference. On the wall, a monitor showed the live broadcast of the show. The segment before his was about celebrity scandals, followed by a cooking demo. But the real kicker was the transition card. Coming up next, the black tech boom. Is it talent or special treatment? Darius clenched his jaw. So this was the angle they were going to take. If they thought they had the upper hand, they were in for a shock. But even he couldn't have predicted just how far they were willing to go to paint him as the beneficiary of a system he'd fought to overcome. When the segment began, Darius was seated across from Madeline Royce, the show's lead anchor. She was a seasoned journalist, known for her tough questions. And as she greeted him, her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Darius Bell," she began, "CEO of Innovis, a true American success story." He gave a polite nod, sensing her tension. He knew what was coming. "Your company recently landed a $200 million government contract, beating out some of the biggest names in tech." "That's impressive," Madeline continued, setting the stage to praise him before launching into the real question. "Some have raised concerns, though, claiming that Innovis benefited from federal diversity incentives. You know, the idea that companies like yours get an edge in these contracts because agencies are looking to diversify their vendors. Is that true?" Darius didn't flinch. "I've heard that argument before," he said calmly. "It's funny, though, when a black entrepreneur wins, suddenly it's special treatment. But when legacy firms run by the same families for generations land those same deals, nobody questions it." The air in the studio shifted. The producers off camera exchanged nervous glances. Madeline, however, held her ground. "So, you're saying race played no role at all in your success?" she probed, digging deeper, attempting to undermine his achievements. Darius chuckled lightly, his voice steady. "Let me ask you this, Madeline. When SpaceX won its NASA contracts, was it because Elon Musk met a diversity quota? When Jeff Bezos landed government deals for Blue Origin, was it because of his background? Or do we only ask that question when the CEO looks like me?" Madeline's eyes flickered briefly, but she didn't back down. "So, you don't believe these diversity programs help?" she asked. "They help level the playing field," Darius replied. "But what people don't realize is that the playing field was never level to begin with." At this, Madeline's smile sharpened, the mask of politeness slipping. She glanced at her cue cards, clearly preparing for her next move. "Well, Darius, you grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, with a single mother. You worked your way up from nothing. That's inspiring. But how does someone with no Ivy League background, no family connections, go from a struggling neighborhood to landing contracts that billion-dollar corporations fail to secure? Did someone pull strings?" Darius tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. It's called work, Madeline. Some of us don't have generational wealth or country club networks to fall back on. So, we build from the ground up. Madeline pressed on. But surely you had help along the way? A mentor, a program, something that gave you an extra push? Darius exhaled, his voice calm but firm. Help came in the form of working 3 jobs while I got my engineering degree. Help came in the form of sleeping in my office while I built my first software prototype because I couldn't afford rent. That's the help I got. Madeline paused as if processing his words. But then she asked a pointed question that would change everything. Some would argue that Black entrepreneurs today have more opportunities than ever before. Programs like affirmative action, minority business grants, and government incentives exist to open doors that weren't open decades ago. Do you think these programs are more beneficial than people realize? Darius leaned forward slightly, the tension building. You know what's funny? He asked. When a Black business owner succeeds, people always ask what programs helped us. But nobody asks which old money bank helped fund a white-owned startup. Nobody asks which family connections got them into Stanford, or which golf buddy invested in their company. The room fell silent. Darius's words had landed like a bomb, and Madeline, for the first time in the interview, seemed momentarily stunned. Madeline regained her composure, her voice adopting a measured tone. But some would say that today's economy is based on hard work, not race, she pressed, attempting to turn the conversation back toward meritocracy. Don't you think success today is about how hard you work, not the color of your skin? Darius exhaled, his voice firm. Let me ask you something, Madeline. Do you really think that if I wasn't exceptional at what I do, I'd be sitting in this chair right now? The tension in the room was palpable. The camera captured the moment, Darius Bell's response hanging in the air. You think I got here because I played the diversity card? He continued. Or do you think I got here despite everything designed to keep me out? Silence followed. No one dared to speak. And in that silence, something changed. Madeline smiled, but it wasn't the same smile. There was something colder about it now. She had been bested, but she wasn't about to give up. Not yet. The silence stretched out, but Madeline Royce wasn't finished. She shifted in her seat, preparing for one final question. Darius had turned the tables, but she was determined to regain control. The question that followed would be the hardest yet. Let's talk about something else then, Madeline said, her tone now shifting from polite curiosity to something colder, more calculated. You present yourself as a self-made success, but let's talk about the public perception of your story. Some say that Black entrepreneurs get an unfair advantage when it comes to media attention. The narrative of overcoming struggle, the underdog story, they say that's more marketable than the thousands of white business owners who work just as hard but don't get the same headlines. Darius sat back slightly, his eyes narrowing as he processed the implications of her words. Oh, so now we get too much attention, he asked, a quiet chuckle escaping his lips. In a world where 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men, where major tech funding still overwhelmingly goes to white-owned startups, the real issue is that people like me get too much press. Madeline's polished smile didn't waver, but a slight shift in her posture betrayed her discomfort. Darius wasn't playing into her narrative. He was dismantling it, piece by piece. Madeline, sensing her question had missed the mark, tried to steer the conversation back. I'm just pointing out that in today's climate, some people feel there's pressure to highlight diversity over pure merit. Darius exhaled slowly, his voice steady. Merit? Right, he said, glancing briefly at the cameras before locking eyes with her. Let me ask you something, Madeline. Do you really think that if I wasn't exceptional at what I do, I'd be sitting in this chair right now? The words hung in the air. Madeline opened her mouth, as if to respond, but Darius pressed on. You think I got here because I played the diversity card? He asked again. Or do you think I got here despite everything that's designed to keep me out? The studio was now silent. The tension in the air was palpable, the audience watching, the crew holding their breath. This wasn't just another interview. This was a reckoning. Madeline, trying desperately to regain control, shifted in her seat. But she wasn't prepared for what Darius would say next. Madeline, noticing the shift in power, took another deep breath, preparing her final blow. She leaned forward slightly, a calculated move to convey intimacy and authority. "Darius, I respect your passion and your drive," she said, her voice slightly less smooth. "But let me ask you something. Do you think some of this outrage is exaggerated? After all, your success story proves that the system isn't as stacked against black entrepreneurs as some claim." Darius's lips pressed into a thin line. He could feel the weight of her question, but he wasn't backing down. "You know," he began, "it's funny how people love to use one success story as proof that a problem doesn't exist. But let me put it this way. If one person climbs out of a burning building, do you point at them and say, 'See, the fire wasn't that bad'?" Madeline hesitated, her mouth slightly agape. The analogy hit home harder than anything before. Darius leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees as he locked eyes with her. "The fact that I made it doesn't mean the system isn't broken," he said, his voice firm but calm. "It just means I fought twice as hard to get through it." The words hung in the air like a weighty truth. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if everyone knew that this moment would define not just the interview, but the larger narrative surrounding Darius Bell and his journey. Madeline opened her mouth to respond, but she paused, realizing the magnitude of what Darius had just said. He had turned the tables in ways she hadn't anticipated, but she wasn't done. She would try one last attempt to steer the conversation in her favor. Madeline, still trying to make sense of the conversation, asked, "What do you say to those who believe that in today's economy, success is simply about hard work, not race? That hard work, not race, is what really determines success?" Darius's voice softened, but it carried with it an undeniable strength. This country loves to tell itself that hard work is the key to success. And yes, hard work matters. But let's be real, Madeline. Black entrepreneurs are still denied loans at twice the rate of white business owners. We still receive less than 2% of venture capital funding. And even when we prove ourselves, we're still asked if we deserved our success. Madeline shifted in her seat, her expression faltering. For the first time in the interview, she looked uncomfortable, unsure of how to respond. But Darius wasn't finished. "So, let's stop pretending the system isn't rigged," Darius said, his voice steady but unyielding. "It is, and the only people who don't see it are the ones it works for." The silence in the room grew heavier. The producers off camera didn't make a move. The audience sat frozen, watching as Darius Bell exposed the uncomfortable truths that the mainstream media had long ignored. Madeline Royce was no longer smiling. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her jaw tight, her expression strained. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. There was no easy comeback this time. She had been caught in the web of her own narrative. Darius adjusted his watch, his gaze unwavering. He knew he had her on the ropes now, but he wasn't done. "The bar isn't in the same place for everyone," Darius said, his voice quieter now, but still full of conviction. "A mediocre white man can fail upwards in this country, but a brilliant black man has to jump through flaming hoops just to get a shot." The words hit like a thunderclap. The air was thick with the weight of his statement, the final nail in the coffin of the conversation. Madeline's lips pressed together, and for the first time, she looked like she was out of her depth. Darius continued, his tone dry but incisive. "A white CEO can run a company into the ground, bankrupt it, lay off thousands of employees, and somehow get hired somewhere else. Meanwhile, a black CEO has one bad quarter, and suddenly it's proof that we weren't ready for leadership." The room held its breath. Darius leaned forward just slightly, his words now taking on the force of a declaration. "And the best part? When we actually make it, people like you sit across from us and ask if we got here because of some special advantage." Madeline's expression had shifted. The studio crew knew they were witnessing something real unfold before their eyes. Darius Bell had been pushed to the edge, and now he was ready to deliver the final blow. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Madeline's. There was no need for theatrics, no need for exaggerated gestures. His words carried the weight of years of struggle, of resilience, of truth. He let the silence linger, a moment heavy with the truth he had just shared. Then he exhaled slowly and began to speak again, his voice measured but firm. "You wanted to talk about fairness, Madeline," he said, his tone almost ironic. "Let's start by telling the truth. The system isn't fair, and for some of us, Success isn't just about hard work. It's about surviving a system that wasn't built for us. Madeline shifted in her seat, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the cue cards in front of her. The studio had gone quiet. The crew, the producers, the audience, everyone knew that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just an interview. This was a reckoning. The words that had just left Darius's mouth weren't just for Madeline. They were for every person who had ever questioned the validity of his success. Every person who had dismissed the struggles that black entrepreneurs like him had faced. The system wasn't designed for people like me, Darius continued, his voice unshakable. I had to be twice as good to get half as much. But even then, I'm still questioned, still scrutinized. Why? Because I'm black, because the system is rigged, and for the people who don't see it, they are the ones benefiting from it. Madeline's expression faltered for a moment, the mask of the seasoned journalist slipping as the reality of what Darius was saying hit her. She had expected a scripted response, something she could easily dismiss. Instead, she had been confronted with raw truth. Darius wasn't finished, though. He leaned forward just slightly, locking eyes with her. His next words would be the ones that would resonate long after the cameras were off. You wanted to talk about fairness, but the truth is, we're not playing on the same field. You want to tell me that the system works because I succeeded? You want to use me as evidence that everything's okay? Darius shook his head. Let me tell you this. Success isn't a fairy tale. It's not handed out based on merit alone. It's a game. And for some of us, that game is rigged. Madeline sat still, her lips pressed tightly together. She had no response. She couldn't. Because Darius had just exposed the truth she had spent her career avoiding. The moment hung in the air long after the cameras stopped rolling. The crew, the producers, and the entire studio knew that they had just witnessed something monumental. Darius Bell had done what no one else had dared to do. He had called out the media, the system, and the very foundation of America's meritocracy. As the segment came to a close, Madeline gave a tight smile. "All right, we need to take a quick break," she said, her voice stiff. "We'll be back with more after this." But her words were hollow, empty in the wake of what had just transpired. The cameras cut, but the damage had been done. Within minutes, clips of the exchange began flooding social media. Twitter exploded with reactions. People were praising Darius for his boldness, for his willingness to speak the truth in a space where most black voices were silenced or dismissed. Truth Hurts began trending. The conversation was no longer about diversity in business. It was about race, about the system, and about who gets to win in America, and who gets questioned when they do. By the time Darius was in his car, his phone was blowing up. Text messages, missed calls, notifications flooding in. Some messages were supportive, others critical. But they all shared one thing in common. The world had heard his message. Not everyone was impressed. While many lauded Darius for his honesty, others took a different view. Critics accused him of playing the race card, of crying victim, and of using his success as an excuse. But Darius didn't care about the critics. He knew they were missing the point. His success wasn't the problem. The system that made it harder for people like him to succeed was. Cable news quickly picked up the story. Some outlets called him brave. Others labeled him combative. But the real story was just beginning. His interview wasn't just another viral moment. It was a reckoning, a moment that would change the conversation around race, success, and opportunity in America. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. Madeline Royce, realizing the gravity of what had happened, quickly issued a statement. "We value open dialogue and diverse perspectives," it read. "While today's discussion became more intense than expected, we stand by our commitment to fair conversations." But Darius wasn't buying it. He knew it wasn't about fairness. It was about control. And for once, he wasn't going to let anyone control the narrative. The aftermath wasn't without its costs. Darius received threats. Some clients pulled out. A major corporate partner reconsidered their commitment. An unmarked package was left outside Innovis headquarters. Nothing inside but a single sheet of paper with the word "enough" written in bold letters. Tasha, ever the pragmatist, suggested getting security. Darius exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. He knew this was the price of speaking out. When a black man stands up too boldly, too unapologetically, the system fights back. But backing down was never an option. Not now. Not when he had finally been heard. The next morning, a surprising offer came through. A network wanted Darius to do a televised special, a one-on-one deep dive about race, business, and the system. It was a rare opportunity, one that many entrepreneurs would kill for. But Darius wasn't interested in doing it for the fame or the recognition. He looked at Tasha, his assistant, and with a quiet determination, he gave his answer. "Tell them I'll do it, but on my terms." Darius Bell's viral moment wasn't just another controversy. It was a reckoning, a moment that forced a conversation about race, merit, and the system. He had become the face of a conversation that had been avoided for far too long. Some called him an activist, others called him arrogant, but no one could ignore him anymore. As he sat in his office looking out over the city, Darius thought about the younger version of himself, the kid from Birmingham, Alabama, who had to fight for every inch of success, the one who had watched doors slam shut while others walked through without knocking. Now, Darius Bell wasn't just a successful entrepreneur. He was a symbol of resistance, a man who had faced a broken system and emerged victorious, not because of any special advantage, but despite it. And as the world continued to debate his words, Darius knew one thing for certain: the conversation had just begun. Darius Bell's story was far from over. His moment on the morning exchange had sparked a fire, one that couldn't be put out. The system had been exposed, the cracks had been shown, and America had been forced to reckon with its own narrative about race, success, and the idea of merit. The real question now was, would the world listen? Would they see Darius Bell not just as an entrepreneur, but as a messenger, calling out the hypocrisy of a system that claims to reward hard work, but so often rewards privilege instead? As Darius prepared for the next phase of his journey, he knew this. His fight was just beginning, and for the first time, he wasn't alone.